course, the Arctic and the Antarctic, the Antarctic by the word is the opposite of the Arctic, and we think of it as opposite on opposite sides of the poles, but it's also opposite in the sense of the conservation challenges and the governance. And for example, in the Arctic, there's a small part of the Arctic that is what we call high seas, that is international waters, right in the central Arctic Ocean. But most of the Arctic, that what we think of as the Arctic, is actually within the real estate of Russia, the United States, and Canada. And Russia, in fact, is probably half of the Arctic. The Antarctic, on the other hand, is claimed by several countries, owned by no one, and there's now being operated under an international agreement through an organization called the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Living Marine Resources, or CAMLR, as we talk about it.
Okay.
And so what that means, if you want to do conservation in the Antarctic, you have to go through this international institution and get them to agree almost on what we call a consensus basis for any management that takes place in Antarctica. So if you're trying to do conservation in the Arctic, you typically work with each one of these countries individually. Can you get them to restrict fishing appropriately, create MPAs appropriately? If you're in Antarctica, you have to work with this international body. We have several grants in both places because of the reasons you would imagine. They are changing very quickly. They're incredibly important ecologically to the planet. And in the case of the Arctic, it's incredibly important to the people that live up there. They are truly also on the front line of climate change. They are seeing dramatic changes in their way of life. And the more that we can, I believe, protect that way of life and give them some resilience to help manage this change, the better off they are. And so some of our grants are trying to do just that. And so we have grants in Canada, in Russia. We used to have some grants in Alaska that are about helping to improve fisheries management and establish some of these long-term protected areas. One of the success stories that we don't hear a lot about here in the American press is that Russia, and President Putin in particular, has been very ambitious and very successful in creating protected areas in the Russian Arctic. In fact, the largest protected area right now in the Arctic is in Russia, and it was declared, and this might be very similar to the United States, it was declared right before his presidential election in March of 2018, and it's around the New Siberian Islands, and it's really another remarkable place. There was a massive protected area created, the world's largest, in Antarctica. And this was really a direct result of some aggressive work from Secretary Kerry and President Obama. They personally lobbied a lot of world leaders to get this consensus in this international institution. And they created what's called the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. And it's over 1 million square kilometers of fully protected area in some places and very strongly protected in others. It was a remarkable success story. It took probably 6 or 7 years of international negotiations to do that one, where in the case of the New Siberian Islands in Russia, that took probably only 2 to 3 years, just to give you a flavor of how it's different.
Okay. And what are the protections? Are they really protecting from commercial fishing in these parts of the world, or is this more protecting from, mining and other ocean exploration, or what would be the pressure on the ecosystem in those places?
So the pressure on the ecosystem in the Antarctic is by and large fishing. And depending on who you talk to, whaling. But that is even changing now that Japan has recently agreed to get out of the Southern Ocean for its whaling. So right now, the only really resource extraction happening in Antarctica is fishing. And the primary species there is what we know of here in the United States is Chilean sea bass. It's called Antarctic toothfish. It's a slight different species than the Chilean toothfish, but that's the primary species. It's a very large, slow-growing predator that is fished by several different countries. The other big fishery in Antarctic is what we call krill. This is a relatively small shrimp-like species done in big nets that is used for feeding salmon. It's used for vitamin supplements. They essentially grind it up in various ways and process it into fish meal and fish oil. And that's been generally a growing fishery in Antarctica. So those are the two big threats. And krill is important because, as you would imagine, a lot of critters feed on that, whether it's the killer whales, the seals, the penguins. It's kind of the base of the food chain in Antarctica.
Sure.
The pressures in the Arctic are, again, very different. There you have not a very large commercial fishery at all because it's been covered in ice. You have very small and probably completely sustainable native fisheries that are going on in all of those countries up there. The biggest threats is probably some of the oil and gas development, particularly in Russia, but also in the United States increasingly, as well as what I'll call the industrialization of the Arctic. We're seeing for the first time ever now shipping lanes and ships transiting the Arctic with the sea ice coming down. We're likely to see lots of other growth of the populations up there, some of the various support facilities. As oil and gas gets built, you're going to see production facilities come online up there. And so I think it's a bigger threat in the Arctic for what we would think of as more traditional kind of energy intensive resource exploitation kind of activities to happen in the Arctic.